19-year-old Amber Meadows often stays at her aunt and uncle's house.
I was really proud of Amber because she had a rough start to life. Her mother wasn't around. She didn't have that role model, but other family members stepped in.
She was just wonderful. She had such personality, very outgoing. She played softball. She was a cheerleader. She excelled at everything that she did.
Amber was very smart. She was always doing great in school, always. I think we were all more afraid she would be bored at school and not apply herself because it was so easy for her.
She was just a delight.
She was just so mature, and everyone just loved when she was around.
Heading out?
Yep.
Take care.
Thanks, Aunt Connie.
911, where is your emergency?
We needed an ambulance and a cop at the Travel Lodge on Arthur Road. My friend was just shot. She's laying in the corner. I'm not sure if she's still alive or not.
Okay, I need you to see if she's breathing. It's
I can't go back up there. We have been kidnapped. We have been kidnapped since yesterday.
The 911 caller reported that 4 suspects, 3 black males and the 1 white male, had brought them to the hotel room and had kept them there in room 48. It was a very serious situation. They know that a victim has been shot. There's a firearm involved. What they discovered was room 48 was unoccupied. They entered the adjoining room, room 47. And that's where they discovered the victim lying on her back, clearly deceased, and had suffering from a gunshot wound to her head. I arrived about 20 minutes after the initial 911 call.
The responding officers find 2 females who are in the parking lot adjacent to the Travel Lodge Hotel.
They were extremely emotional. You could tell they had been through a very traumatic incident.
They were frantic, they were traumatized. We learned that their friend who had been killed just moments before was a girl named Amber Meadows, just 19 years of age. They indicated that they had been held hostage for an extended period of time, and that during that time, their friend had been shot, and in the chaos that followed the shooting, they escaped. Remarkably, when the girls fled the crime scene, they seized the hooded white sweatshirt that had suspected blood on it.
The officer said that this belonged to the suspect that they said shot their friend inside the hotel. So we knew that at that moment, that is a piece of evidence that we really need to have processed as quickly as possible.
Detective Bragg scans the hotel room for evidence.
It was definitely a disturbing scene. There were signs of a struggle. Chairs were overturned. Lamps were broken. The victim, she was lying in a pool of blood. It reminds you of, for lack of a better term, an execution of sorts. Having worked a lot of homicide investigations, you don't often see a victim of that age, 19 years old, hasn't really lived her life yet. It was a bad situation, very disturbing to see. Our crime scene unit, they were brought to the scene to process those 2 rooms. There were a number of items there that could potentially have some forensic value. There was a bullet fragment that was lodged in a door frame near the victim's body. There was also small cardboard packaging, what we customarily would see as a divider in ammo boxes, ammunition packaging. And as they were beginning to search the trash can, they noticed that there was a receipt from a local Walmart store, so that obviously piqued our interest.
Investigators attempt to contact Amber's relatives.
We spent a good deal of time just trying to locate family members. We did find a person that was able to contact the victim's mother.
Amber's mother then calls Amber's Aunt Connie.
Hello?
She said, I heard that somebody got shot in Beckley, and she said, I heard it was my daughter. I heard it was Amber, and she was hysterical. She called the police, and she insisted, tell me. And they told her, yes, it was your daughter that got shot. She was extremely hysterical and telling me what happened, and the rest of us were just heartbroken. She told me that she got shot in the head. I still am in shock. I don't know if I'll ever come around to the fact that this has happened.
I didn't want to think about Amber in that situation with no help. It's just to this day, I don't want to think about her last moments. I can't believe this happened.
Back at the hotel, Detective Bragg hunts for more evidence.
Once we began to look around, we noticed that there were multiple cameras around the hotel. So we were pretty excited. We wanted to find out who had rented that room.
Can we see your security camera footage, please?
It should show us our players that were involved. It should show them with the victims. Unfortunately, we discovered that the cameras were not functioning at the time. So immediately, that was our first dead end. They were able to provide a copy of a driver's license that had been used to rent the rooms.
I need you to run an ID for me, please.
Now we have a name to go with a person that rented the room.
Okay, what do you got?
That was some pivotal information that had to be followed up on very quickly. This is a person we've got to look at.
Well, that's bad news.
But unfortunately, it turned out to be a stolen driver's license. The owner's uninvolved, it turned out.
Word comes back from the department that Amber's two friends are ready to talk.
But to the best that you can, if you could just tell us what happened.
Last night, we was at the gas station. Amber had put in to pee, and the car pulled up, and they all jumped out and opened up our doors, and was just screaming.
We have two witnesses here who have seen this entire event, have been through this traumatic incident together. They have all the pieces of the puzzle, and we know we need that as quickly as possible.
The first witness claims the friends were parked outside a local gas station in Amber's white coupe during the early hours when four men arrived in a car.
Amber had put in to pee, and the car pulled up, and they all jumped out. And that's where Amber was, and she's in the storage in the bathroom.
The victim overhears the name of one of the men, Laquan.
And Laquan went in and got her, and they seemed fine, but they was arguing, a little bit.
These men, they pressured him to return with them to the Travel Lodge in Beckley. The women decided that the best option was to do as these men said and go to this hotel.
Once we got upstairs, everything changed.
The suspect immediately became aggressive, had a firearm in his hand, told them as soon as the door closed that no one was leaving that hotel room until he got what he wanted. And they're telling us they had been taunted with firearms, that they had had lasers from the firearms pointed at their heads throughout the night.
The witness claims Laquan's anger was focused on Amber.
Fighting with her, and he would make her get up and go to the bathroom and made her lay in the tub. And then he would tell her to get out and sit in a chair. Then scream at us a little bit.
Laquan said that Amber owed him money and that no one was leaving that hotel room until he got that money that he was owed.
It was just chaos for a long time.
Detectives pressed the second witness for details of the actual murder.
Then he pulled out a book bag. The book bag had bullets, guns. He had duct tape. Everybody was in one room where the beds was.
She said at one point, the suspect took Amber into the adjoining room and they heard a scuffle, an argument, and subsequently heard a gunshot. And once they heard that gunshot, they ran in there and saw that Amber was in the floor.
It was like she shot herself. I knew she did. She wouldn't have done that.
At that point, everyone scattered. You know, the suspects and the victims all ran from the hotel room. We knew that no weapons had been recovered to the scene, so these individuals were still armed at that time. We had a really dangerous set of individuals out there. We wanted to get them off the street as quickly as we possibly could. The shooter's name was Laquan. They also mentioned that a white male who was the driver of the suspect's vehicle went by the nickname of KB. The names didn't mean a whole lot to us at that moment.
Sergeant Bragg heads to the gas station where the women were abducted.
Can I see all the security footage from yesterday evening, please?
We hoped this was a trail we were going to be able to start down to identifying the people responsible.
Can you cue it up for 12:45 a.m., please?
We saw Amber's vehicle pull into the parking area, park in front of the entrance.
Play it again. Rewind. Play on.
Once it parks, we see Amber exit that vehicle from the driver's side of the car.
Can you switch camera, please?
You see the victim walk inside and immediately go to the restroom.
Exterior again.
We were waiting for suspect vehicles to arrive on scene. We knew now we were going to have our suspects on video. This could change everything.
The exterior camera shows a red Jeep Cherokee come onto the parking lot at a high rate of speed. It parks just short of the sidewalk outside of the convenience store.
Four males exit the vehicle. A white male suspect enters the store. The three black males immediately approach the white car. One of our suspects leans into the car, has a conversation with those victims.
Can you get me any closer?
And then quickly goes inside the store.
That man looks about briefly. And then, really inexplicably, goes into the female restroom. Is in there just moments. And comes out next to and escorting Amber Meadows out of the restroom.
And then he walks her out, and they exit the store together.
Okay, zoom in.
Detective Bragg looks for a detailed view of the suspect.
Can you slow it down, please? Freeze it.
The footage from the gas station wasn't the quality where we could immediately identify a person.
Exterior again.
We went back to the exterior cameras, began to review those, and watched this interaction in the parking lot. We actually see one of our suspects wearing a white hooded sweatshirt. You actually see him remove that sweatshirt.
Detectives suspect this could be the bloodied hoodie taken by the victims after the shooting.
He provides it to the suspect that entered the store, and you actually see him put it on.
Ultimately, Miss Meadows gets back into the car.
He appeared to urge one of his helpers, one of the other suspects, to get into the vehicle with our victims. They said that this guy had gotten in the car. They felt that that was to make sure that they came to the hotel that they were told to go to.
And we can see finger pointing, gesticulations by this man toward Miss Meadows. Miss Meadows moves the vehicle while this assailant is standing next to it, hitting him with the door. He approaches the middle hood of the vehicle. He pounds the hood of the vehicle, and then he goes to the passenger side.
You see him enter the red SUV. And then ultimately, you see both of those vehicles leave the parking lot and head toward the hotel area. The cameras from the gas station allow us to view their physical characteristics. We knew that we were dealing with 3 African-American males and a white male. And we now know what kind of vehicle we're looking for. Red Jeep Grand Cherokee, owned by the white male suspect, KB.
Police approach Amber's family for details on her personal life that could help identify her kidnappers.
When Amber was 19, she was really in a different place than we'd ever seen.
I really, to this day, have no idea what the big change was.
Amber had begun to become distant from her family members.
She was involved with people she should not be involved with. She was in a situation where there was a lot of drugs around.
And it happened so quick, so quickly. I couldn't believe that this girl that I knew that was so smart had fallen into such bad company and bad influence. Just couldn't believe it.
The victim's family believed Amber was associated with people involved in drugs and things of that nature. And we also learned that Amber had been dating or seeing a boyfriend. We felt that that was very important. It was something we wanted to follow up on.
The victims never mention Amber's boyfriend in their interviews, and police find no evidence he was with them on the night of the murder.
Ultimately, as we looked into it more, there was no indication that he had been involved in the shooting or anything of that nature.
With Amber's boyfriend not considered a suspect, detectives follow up on the receipt found at the crime scene.
It was a receipt from a local Walmart store, and on the receipt it showed that boxes of ammunition had been purchased the previous day. We knew we had to get to that gun counter, find out if they had a name that we can track down.
Can you pull up some customer information for me, please?
Walmart was able to provide very limited information in relation to the identification card that was used to make the purchase. But what they were able to provide is a date of birth from the ID. And what we discovered is that date of birth matched the stolen identification card that we had a scan from at the hotel.
Detectives turn their attention to the one thing they can rely on: the security footage from the Walmart.
Can you pull up some CCTV, please?
They have a multitude of cameras.
Okay, time of purchase was 6:33 p.m. Can you cue it up around there, please? A few minutes back.
Their surveillance system is wonderful, and the quality of the video is superb.
We really wanted to see the faces of these individuals. We were pretty excited. We knew that there was going to be footage of our suspects. There was no doubt on that. We knew at that moment, this is a break in the case.
The video shows three men leaning over the counter,
kind of pointing out items that they want to see. They retrieved 2 boxes of ammunition.
you see these three men giddy like they're at a toy store picking out a toy when they're actually purchasing ammunition that's going to take someone's life.
Okay, freeze it.
You see a man with long dreadlocked hair.
Can you zoom in?
All of the three individuals that were on that video matched the physical characteristics and images that we had seen from the gas station footage. So we felt like we were looking at our suspects. But it was extremely important to see who they were. We needed a camera basically pointed right at the faces of these individuals.
Can you switch to the exit cameras, please?
They had installed cameras in the entrance area of the store. As you play the footage forward, you see them begin to exit the store. That showed the faces and physical characteristics of all of these suspects.
Freeze it there. Perfect.
Each individual was clearly visible. Anybody that knew these people would immediately recognize them from footage of this nature. It was extremely exciting.
Cue up the car park camera at the same time.
One of the things that we wanted to see was video of this suspect vehicle leaving the scene with our suspects inside.
Now, where are they going?
At a pretty significant distance, you see them enter a dark-colored vehicle. We knew it wasn't the red SUV that we had seen.
And we could not see the white male who we had seen on the surveillance video at the convenience store.
Can you rewind 20 minutes before they were buying ammunition?
Detective Bragg looks to the suspect's arrival at the store for a closer shot of the car.
You see the vehicle rolling onto the lot of the Walmart.
The three black males that made the ammunition purchase exit the vehicle, enter the store.
Can you zoom in?
And a white male suspect exits the vehicle and enters the store himself.
Rewind, play it again.
Detectives suspect this individual could be the white man seen at the gas station.
And we were extraordinarily happy. We now had images that we could use to identify all four of our suspects. Pretty quickly on, one of the Raleigh County deputies identified the white male. It was Caleb Bird.
Bragg is certain Caleb Bird is the man the victims referred to as KB.
The officer was aware that Caleb Bird had recently been in control of a red Jeep SUV.
Police trace Caleb Bird to his parents' apartment.
One of our officers spotted the red SUV at that apartment complex. I told Caleb on the phone to walk outside with his hands clearly visible. I was able to take him into custody in front of the residence.
Detectives press Bird for his version of events.
He portrayed himself as almost an unwilling participant.
Those three individuals that are involved. I'm not cutting you off to be mean, but I want to stop you right there just for a second and explain something to you, okay? We can't do that part where you just said there's three individuals that are involved. No. You see what I'm saying?
Mr. Bird began to realize that there was a lot of evidence that incriminated him and linked him to the death of Amber Meadows.
He was able to identify two suspects and provide their names.
Tyree and this guy named Shocker. I don't know his real name. That's his street name. What do you know about him? I don't know much about him. I've only been around him 2 or 3 times, honestly. And then there's David Hudson.
Caleb was able to provide to us. David Hudson's middle name is Laquan, and that is the name that he typically, friends would call him Laquan.
Laquan is the name victims gave police for the man they believe may have shot Amber.
Caleb acknowledged that they had been driving around. David Hudson had actually been in the passenger seat and had observed Amber's car at the gas station. He told Caleb to pull into the gas station, park beside her vehicle.
I go inside, and then they went over and talked to her, and I went back to my car. He was intimidating her a little bit, talking to her. Because, I mean, was he accusing her of the... Yeah. Okay. And then he started hugging on her, gave her a kiss. Okay. And so I thought it was all cool. We're there a little while longer. Tyreek gets in the vehicle with them, Hudson and Shaka. They got in my vehicle, and we followed them to the traffic lights.
He said everything seemed okay. They were getting along until that hotel room door closed. And that was when he said Mr. Hudson told him that nobody was leaving until he got what he wanted.
And just talking about something being taken, trying to intimidate her. He's flashing guns at him, and he was pulling back the hammer, putting it up to her head, and, intimidating her, making her cry.
Caleb Bird indicates he tried to reassure Amber that she wouldn't be hurt.
And I said, it's empty. And then they said, no, it ain't, no, it ain't, no, it ain't, bow. And it went off right in front of my face.
You knew at that moment, now we've got the identification of our actual shooter who's taken Amber's life.
Police quickly locate 2 of the 3 remaining suspects, Tyreek Pearl and Antonio Williams, a.k.a. Shaka. But David Laquan Hudson remains at large.
Now, our entire focus is tracking down David Hudson.
Later that day, Detective Bragg receives an unexpected call.
Sergeant Bragg speaking. Who is this?
It was very surprising to receive that call. It was David Hudson's mother. David Hudson's mother contacted myself and advised me that he was willing to turn himself in. We were skeptical, to say the least. We weren't sure if he would come in or not. So simultaneously, we also had officers out searching residences. We went into a number of residences, checked areas that he frequented. But he did turn himself in.
With David Laquan Hudson now in custody, detectives attempt to interview him.
You've got this mountain of evidence suggesting that someone has committed this crime. You know the who and how and where and all the other questions. You just don't know why this thing occurred. And really, the person that did it is the only one that can tell you that.
I'd like to ask you some questions.
So when they refuse to talk to you, it's very frustrating.
Despite David Hudson's refusal to tell the truth, the physical evidence cannot lie.
That particular hoodie is the hoodie that was provided by the 911 caller when she initially encountered the law enforcement officers.
Amber Meadows' blood was deposited on that hoodie, which is entirely consistent with a close-range shot in a confined space.
The gas station surveillance footage was pivotal in that moment because it showed our suspect being the last person to wear that hoodie before arriving at the hotel. Now we have a forensic link that is tying David Hudson to the murder.
In January 2022, the trial begins.
When we went through the trial and I heard all the details of everything that went on, that was the most heartbreaking thing I ever heard in my life, to know that she had to suffer that long. I mean, she knew something might happen, and it just broke my heart to think that she was that afraid at that moment.
Antonio Roger Williams pleads guilty to kidnapping and voluntary manslaughter and is sentenced to 20 years. Tyreek Pearl and driver Caleb Bird plead guilty to conspiracy to commit kidnapping and murder. Both escape prison time in return for their testimonies. David Laquan Hudson maintains his innocence, but is found guilty of 3 counts of kidnapping, first-degree murder, use of a firearm, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping and murder.
Ultimately, his sentence was life without parole, so he'll never be released, which I think is a comfort, not only to the family, but really to society in general.
The fact that these 3 women who are begging and pleading for their lives for hours, and that doesn't move you, cause you to stop, it tells me that you're just devoid of a conscience. It shows that you're a depraved individual.
David Hudson never explains why he kidnapped Amber Meadows, but police think it may have been related to money.
Everything points to the fact that Mr. Hudson was involved in some sort of transaction. There was a money issue of some sort. And ultimately, I think that Mr. Hudson chose to take out his anger on Amber because he wasn't able to access the individual involved. She was the proxy for something that she wasn't even responsible for.
The CCTV reveals the true sequence of events on that tragic night.
These 3 friends having a good time. They were just enjoying life. But there was a real transition at the gas station. David Hudson began to be nice to them, began to suggest that they come to a hotel. Got one of the other suspects to ride in the vehicle with the firearm. That was to ensure that they followed to that location, that they did as they were told.
When the girls entered the hotel room, it was like a switch got flipped.
All right, everybody, sit down now, everybody.
A chair was placed in front of the door. One of the men sat in that chair with a gun.
Listen, I'm not here to play.
He ordered them at gunpoint to stay on the bed.
David Hudson had promised to kill these girls so many times that at the end of this experience, if he didn't do that, then his reputation and his warped mind would be diminished and no one would take him seriously.
Let's go, get up.
Hudson raises the firearm. He looks square at the back of Amber Meadows' head, pulls the trigger, and kills her instantly. The terrible part of this case and this crime is that her story never gets finished, that the opportunities that are before a 19-year-old are never fully realized because of the actions of another.
1 week after her murder, Amber is laid to rest.
So many people came, and one of the saddest days of my life.
I just remember all of us being around that day, just unbelievably devastated that this light was gone. I mean, at such a young age, she was just beginning to reach her potential. I want people to remember Amber as a kid who wanted to do all the right things. She was bright, she was funny, she had personality, she cared about her family, she cared about her friends, and I wanted to remember that about her.
She was the most fun person. You couldn't help but love her. Bad things happen to good people, and she got off on the wrong trail, but she was still a good girl, and I loved her dearly and always will. We all miss her so much.
There were a couple of calls about an object floating in the water.
The detectives, they just tell me, we found Omar.
The surveillance footage was a smoking gun.
This could be the break that we've been waiting for.
There is a particular kind of silence that exists in places people believe are safe, a silence not born from emptiness, but from assumption. It is the quiet confidence of a location that has been defined, over time, by beauty rather than danger, by leisure rather than threat. On the island of Maui, that silence often takes the form of soft ocean air moving through open spaces, of distant waves folding into shorelines shaped by volcanic stone, of footsteps that do not carry urgency because there is no reason for them to. It is a place where movement feels unguarded, where attention drifts outward instead of inward, where the idea of risk exists but rarely feels immediate. And yet, within that same environment, the conditions for something else can exist, not visibly, not dramatically, but quietly, in the margins of routine. The early 2000s marked a period when Maui continued to grow as a destination, drawing visitors into a landscape that felt both expansive and contained at the same time. Resorts, coastal access points, and residential areas created overlapping zones where locals and visitors moved through the same spaces without necessarily sharing the same awareness of them. For most, this overlap produced nothing more than ordinary interaction, brief exchanges, or complete anonymity. But anonymity, while often harmless, carries a second function. It allows actions to occur without immediate scrutiny, decisions to unfold without interruption, and intentions to remain obscured until they manifest into something visible. In this setting, the line between normalcy and disruption is not marked by warning signs. It is marked by moments, by brief intersections between people whose paths were never meant to cross in a consequential way. A person present in the wrong place at the wrong time does not initially recognize that anything is wrong. The environment does not signal it. The surroundings do not change. The air remains the same, the sounds continue uninterrupted, and yet, within that continuity, something begins to shift. Not gradually, not in a way that can be traced in advance, but suddenly, as if an unseen threshold has been crossed. What defines the case that would later be understood as a robbery turned homicide is not a single act but a transition. It is the movement from one intention to another, from an act centered on property to one that results in the loss of life. At its origin, the situation does not carry the weight of fatal consequence. It begins with the logic of opportunity, the identification of something that can be taken, the assumption that the act can be completed without escalation. This assumption is not uncommon. It exists in many acts of theft, where the primary objective is limited, and the expectation is that the situation will remain contained within that boundary. But boundaries in real situations are not fixed. They depend on variables that cannot always be predicted or controlled. The presence of another person, the timing of movement, the reaction to being confronted, the interpretation of threat, all of these factors can converge in a matter of seconds. When they do, the original structure of the act begins to collapse. What was intended to be a contained action becomes unstable, and instability introduces the possibility of escalation. In the Maui case, that escalation did not occur in stages that could be clearly separated. There is no evidence of a gradual buildup that could be reconstructed with precision. Instead, the shift appears to have been immediate, tied to a moment of direct interaction between the individual attempting to take something and the person whose presence disrupted that attempt. This interaction is central to understanding what followed, not because it can be described in detail, but because it represents the point at which intention changed. The absence of detailed observation makes this moment difficult to define, but its existence is supported by the outcome. The presence of both theft-related disturbance and evidence of violence indicates that the two were not separate events. They were part of the same sequence, a sequence that began with one objective and ended with another. The transition between them is where the case becomes most significant, because it highlights how quickly an action can move beyond its original scope when confronted with resistance or exposure. There is a tendency, when examining violent outcomes, to search for signs that the violence was always intended, that it was built into the situation from the beginning. In this case, the available information does not support that conclusion. There is no indication of premeditated intent to cause death. Instead, the violence appears to have emerged as a response, a reaction to circumstances that developed in real time. This distinction does not reduce the severity of the outcome, but it changes the way the event is understood. It shifts the focus from long-term planning to immediate decision-making under pressure. The concept of pressure, in this context, is not abstract. It is situational. It arises from the sudden need to respond to an unexpected variable, to adapt to a situation that is no longer controlled. When a person engaged in theft is confronted, the situation becomes unstable. The risk of being identified, stopped, or reported introduces urgency, and urgency alters behavior. Decisions that might not be considered under normal conditions become possible when the perception of risk increases. This is where the line between nonviolent and violent action becomes fragile. It is not a clear boundary, but a threshold that can be crossed quickly, sometimes without a fully conscious transition. The Maui case exists within this threshold, within the space where an act intended to remain within the limits of property crime moves into a different category entirely. The speed of this transition is one of the most unsettling aspects of the case, because it suggests that the outcome was not the result of a prolonged sequence, but of a brief, critical moment. The environment in which this occurred plays a role, not as a cause, but as a context that allowed the initial conditions to exist. A location where people move freely, where access points are open, where individuals may be present without close observation, creates opportunities for both ordinary activity and opportunistic behavior. In such environments, the difference between safety and vulnerability is not always visible. It depends on timing, on coincidence, on the intersection of unrelated actions. For the person who became the victim, there is no indication that the situation carried any immediate warning. The presence at the scene was not unusual, the environment was not inherently threatening, and there were no clear signals that the moment would become significant. This is what makes the case particularly difficult to process. The event did not emerge from a pattern of escalating conflict or from a known risk. It emerged from a convergence, from a point where two separate trajectories met and produced an irreversible outcome. What remains after the event itself is not just the fact that a life was lost, but the recognition of how narrow the margin was between what happened and what might have happened instead. A different timing, a different movement, a different absence or presence, any of these variables could have altered the sequence. But in this instance, they aligned in a way that allowed the escalation to occur. The Maui case does not begin with violence, and that is precisely what makes its beginning so important. It begins with something smaller, something that might, under different circumstances, have remained contained and resolved without severe consequence. The transformation of that initial act into a fatal outcome is what defines the case, and it is this transformation that will shape every stage of the investigation that follows. On the surface, life on the island of Maui moves with a rhythm that feels detached from urgency. The pace is slower, the atmosphere shaped by openness, by coastlines that stretch without obstruction, and by communities that exist in a balance between tourism and routine life. For visitors, this rhythm often translates into a sense of ease, a feeling that the environment itself offers a kind of protection, that the boundaries between public and private spaces are softened by familiarity and trust. It is this perception that defines the context in which the events of this case unfolded, a context where vulnerability is not always recognized because it does not appear in obvious forms. During the early 2000s, Maui had already established itself as one of the most prominent travel destinations within the state of Hawaii. The island attracted a steady flow of tourists drawn by its natural beauty, its beaches, and its reputation as a place of relaxation. Resorts and residential areas often existed side by side, creating environments where temporary visitors and long-term residents shared the same physical spaces without necessarily sharing the same awareness of those spaces. This overlap produced a unique dynamic, one where individuals unfamiliar with the area moved through it with a sense of openness, while those more familiar with its structure understood both its conveniences and its gaps. The victim in this case existed within that shared environment, present at a location that did not inherently signal danger. There is no available information to suggest that the victim was engaged in any activity that would have increased risk, nor is there evidence of any prior connection to the individual responsible for the crime. This absence of personal linkage is significant because it frames the event not as the result of targeted intent, but as the outcome of circumstance. The victim was not selected based on identity, history, or relationship. Instead, the presence at a particular place and time became the defining factor. In environments like Maui, where movement between spaces is fluid, the concept of access becomes critical. Many areas, whether residential or connected to tourist activity, are designed for ease of entry and exit. This design supports the flow of daily life, but it also creates conditions in which boundaries are less rigid than they might be in more controlled settings. The idea of intrusion, in such contexts, does not always involve forced entry or overt disruption. It can occur quietly, within the margins of normal activity, without immediately drawing attention. This context is essential for understanding how the initial phase of the case developed. The presence of an individual with the intent to commit theft is not, in itself, an anomaly within a setting where property can be accessed with relative ease. What transforms the situation into something more significant is not the presence of that intent, but the convergence of that intent with the presence of the victim. The moment of overlap between these two elements is where the context shifts from background to central importance. The victim's role within this shift is defined not by action but by existence. Being present at the scene during the act of theft introduced an element that altered the structure of the situation. Without that presence, the act may have remained within the boundaries of property crime, completed without confrontation or escalation. With that presence, however, the situation became dynamic, requiring immediate responses from both parties involved. This is where the environment, previously neutral, becomes a stage for interaction. The nature of this interaction cannot be fully reconstructed, but its implications are clear. The presence of another person during an act of theft introduces variables that cannot be controlled in advance. Reactions may differ depending on perception, on instinct, on the immediate assessment of risk. For the person attempting to take property, the sudden presence of the victim may represent a threat to the success of the act, a risk of exposure or interruption. For the victim, the realization of intrusion may provoke a response aimed at stopping or confronting the act. These responses, occurring within a confined timeframe, create a feedback loop of tension. It is within this feedback loop that the potential for escalation emerges. The transition from a nonviolent objective to a violent outcome does not require premeditation when the conditions for escalation are present. It requires only a moment in which control is lost, in which the situation moves beyond the original intention. The victim, by being present, becomes part of that moment, not as a participant in a conflict that was planned, but as an element that transforms the situation into something unpredictable. The broader context of Maui as a tourist destination adds another layer to this dynamic. Visitors often move through unfamiliar spaces with a sense of trust, relying on the general perception of safety associated with the location. This trust is not misplaced in a general sense, but it can obscure the possibility of isolated incidents. The absence of visible threat does not eliminate risk. It simply reduces the likelihood that risk will be anticipated. In this way, the environment contributes indirectly to vulnerability, not by creating danger, but by masking it. At the same time, the presence of opportunity for theft within such environments is tied to the accessibility of property. Items left unattended, spaces that are not fully secured, and the movement of people in and out of areas without strict monitoring all contribute to a landscape where opportunistic behavior can occur. The individual responsible for the initial act of theft operates within this landscape, guided by the perception that the act can be completed without interference. This perception, however, is contingent on conditions that are not guaranteed. The victim's presence disrupts those conditions. It introduces uncertainty into a situation that was initially defined by expectation. The expectation that the act would remain unseen, that it would proceed without interruption, is replaced by the need to respond to a new variable. This shift is critical because it marks the point at which the situation moves from static to reactive. The actions that follow are no longer guided solely by initial intent, but by the need to navigate an evolving scenario. In examining the victim within this context, it is important to maintain focus on the absence of agency in the development of the situation. The victim did not create the conditions for the crime, nor did they initiate the sequence of events. Their role is defined by circumstance, by being in a position where the actions of another intersected with their presence. This distinction underscores the randomness inherent in the case, the way in which outcomes can be shaped by factors that are beyond individual control. The environment, the timing, and the convergence of unrelated actions all contribute to a situation where the boundary between ordinary life and critical event becomes indistinct. In Maui, where daily activity often unfolds without incident, this boundary is rarely considered. It exists, but it remains unseen until it is crossed. In this case, the crossing occurred not through a gradual progression but through a sudden shift, a moment in which the context changed irreversibly. Understanding the victim and the context in this way does not provide answers to every question, but it establishes the framework within which the rest of the case must be examined. It highlights the importance of environment, not as a determining factor, but as a condition that shapes how events can unfold. It emphasizes the role of timing, of presence, of the unpredictable nature of human interaction when intentions collide. As the case moves forward into the reconstruction of the incident itself, this context remains essential. It is the foundation upon which the sequence of events is built, the backdrop that allows the transition from theft to violence to be understood not as an isolated act, but as the product of a specific convergence of circumstances. The incident itself unfolds within a narrow window of time, a sequence defined not by duration but by the intensity of change that occurs within it. In a setting on the island of Maui, where movement is typically unremarkable and interactions pass without consequence, this particular moment stands apart because it marks the point at which intention and reality diverge. What begins as an act shaped by a limited objective does not remain within those limits. Instead, it shifts rapidly, transforming into something that neither follows the logic of its origin nor allows for easy reconstruction afterward. At the outset, the situation is structured around the presence of an individual engaged in the act of taking property. The indicators of this phase are reflected in the condition of the environment, where signs of disturbance align with the characteristics of theft rather than confrontation. There is no evidence at this stage of preparation for violence, no indication that the act was designed to involve direct harm. The structure of the event, at this point, remains consistent with an opportunistic approach, one that relies on access and the absence of interference. This initial structure is fragile, dependent on conditions that are not guaranteed to remain stable. The critical variable emerges in the form of the victim's presence, an element that introduces immediate uncertainty into the situation. The presence is not anticipated, and because it is not anticipated, it disrupts the assumptions upon which the act of theft is based. What was expected to proceed without interruption now requires response, and that response must be immediate. The moment of contact between the two individuals represents the turning point of the entire sequence. It is the point at which the situation ceases to be defined solely by the intent to take property and begins to be shaped by interaction. The nature of this interaction cannot be described in specific terms, but its existence is evident in the outcome. The presence of both theft-related disturbance and signs of violence indicates that the interaction was direct and consequential, that it altered the course of events in a way that could not be reversed. Within this moment, several possibilities converge. The victim, upon becoming aware of the intrusion, may have reacted in a way that signaled resistance or attempted intervention. The individual engaged in theft, confronted with this reaction, may have perceived a threat to the success of the act or to personal safety. These perceptions, occurring simultaneously and under pressure, create a dynamic in which decisions are made without the benefit of time or reflection. The situation becomes defined by immediacy, by the need to act rather than to consider. It is within this environment of immediacy that escalation occurs. The transition from nonviolent intent to violent action does not require a deliberate shift in long-term objective. It requires only a moment in which the perceived need to resolve the situation overrides the original boundaries of the act. The boundary between taking property and causing harm, which might appear clear in theory, becomes indistinct in practice when the situation is unstable. The presence of another person transforms the act from a solitary action into a confrontation, and confrontation introduces the potential for force. The evidence of this escalation is found in the condition of the scene. The signs of disturbance extend beyond what would be expected from theft alone, indicating that the interaction involved physical struggle or force. At the same time, the absence of indicators associated with premeditated violence suggests that this force was not planned in advance. Instead, it appears to have emerged as a direct response to the unfolding situation, a reaction to conditions that developed in real time. This distinction is critical because it frames the incident as a sequence rather than a single act. The theft and the violence are not separate events but interconnected phases of the same process. The shift between them is not marked by a pause or a clear decision point, but by a continuous escalation, a progression that moves rapidly from one state to another. This continuity makes it difficult to isolate the exact moment at which the situation changed, but it also emphasizes how closely linked the two phases are. As the escalation reaches its conclusion, the outcome becomes irreversible. The actions taken within that brief window result in the loss of life, transforming what began as a property crime into a fatal event. This transformation is not accompanied by evidence of prolonged intent or extended conflict. Instead, it reflects the consequences of a moment in which control was lost, in which the situation moved beyond the capacity of either individual to manage it without severe consequence. The aftermath of the incident is defined by stillness, by the abrupt end of movement and interaction. The environment, which had been the setting for both the initial act and the escalation, returns to its prior state, offering no immediate indication of what has occurred beyond the physical evidence left behind. This contrast between the intensity of the event and the neutrality of the surroundings contributes to the difficulty of reconstructing the sequence. The environment does not preserve the dynamics of the interaction, only its results. The absence of witnesses further complicates the understanding of the incident. Without external observation, the sequence must be inferred from the available evidence, which provides information about outcomes, but not about the precise progression of actions. This limitation means that the incident cannot be described in complete detail, that certain aspects remain undefined. However, the structure of the event, as indicated by the evidence, remains clear. It is a structure characterized by an initial act of theft, a moment of contact, a rapid escalation, and a fatal outcome. The role of timing within this sequence cannot be overstated. Each phase follows the previous one without delay, creating a chain of events that unfolds within a compressed time frame. There is no extended period in which the situation stabilizes or de-escalates. Instead, the progression moves in a single direction, from opportunity to confrontation to violence. This linear progression reinforces the idea that the outcome was not the result of a prolonged process, but of a brief convergence of factors. In examining the incident, it is important to recognize that the escalation was not inevitable but possible. The same initial conditions, under different circumstances, might not have led to the same result. The presence of the victim, the reaction to that presence, and the response of the individual engaged in theft all contribute to a specific outcome that is contingent on their interaction. This contingency highlights the unpredictability inherent in such situations, the way in which small variations can lead to significantly different consequences. The incident on Maui, therefore, is defined not only by what occurred but by how it occurred. It illustrates the vulnerability of situations that appear controlled, the way in which a single variable can alter the trajectory of an event. It demonstrates how quickly the boundaries between different categories of behavior can dissolve when conditions change, how an act that begins within one framework can end within another. As the sequence concludes, what remains is a set of facts that establish the progression from theft to violence, from intention to outcome. The details of the interaction may never be fully known, but the structure of the event provides enough information to understand its nature. It is an event marked by sudden change, by the loss of control, and by the irreversible consequences of a moment in which the original intent could no longer contain the situation. The investigation into the incident on the island of Maui begins not with clarity, but with fragments. What remains after the event is not a complete narrative, but a collection of physical indicators, environmental conditions, and inferred sequences that must be assembled into something coherent. Unlike cases where witnesses provide a timeline or where surveillance captures movement, this case depends heavily on interpretation. Each piece of evidence must be considered not only for what it shows, but for what it suggests about the moments that preceded it. The initial phase of the investigation focuses on the most immediate and tangible aspect of the scene, the signs of intrusion. These signs establish the foundation upon which the rest of the inquiry is built. Disturbances consistent with theft indicate that property was the initial target, confirming that the event did not begin as an act of violence. This distinction is important, as it shapes the direction of the investigation from the outset. Instead of searching for motives rooted in personal conflict, investigators are guided toward the possibility of opportunistic behavior, toward individuals who may have been seeking access rather than confrontation. From this starting point, attention shifts to the spatial arrangement of the scene. The distribution of disturbed areas, the positioning of objects, and the overall condition of the environment provide clues about movement within the space. These elements suggest that the act of theft was in progress when it was interrupted. The interruption is not directly observed, but it is inferred from the transition in the nature of the disturbance. Where theft alone would produce a certain pattern of activity, the presence of additional disruption indicates that the situation changed, that the initial action was no longer proceeding as intended. This inferred interruption becomes the central focus of the investigation because it represents the point at which the event diverges from its original path. Investigators must determine not only that the interruption occurred, but how it influenced the actions that followed. Without witnesses, this determination relies on the relationship between different forms of evidence. The presence of both theft-related indicators and signs of violence suggests that the two are connected, that they are part of the same sequence rather than separate incidents. Establishing this connection requires careful analysis. Investigators examine the timing implied by the condition of the scene, considering how quickly one set of actions could transition into another. The absence of evidence indicating prolonged separation between theft and violence supports the conclusion that the escalation was immediate. This immediacy is a critical element because it reinforces the idea that the violence was not premeditated but reactive. It emerged in response to the interruption, rather than as a continuation of a prior plan. At the same time, investigators must consider the possibility of alternative explanations. Could the signs of violence have occurred independently of the theft? Could there have been multiple individuals involved, each contributing to different aspects of the scene? These questions are necessary, not because they are supported by direct evidence, but because they test the consistency of the primary hypothesis. By evaluating these alternatives and finding them less consistent with the available data, investigators strengthen the conclusion that the event was a single, continuous sequence. The process of identifying potential suspects is shaped by this conclusion. If the event began as a theft and escalated into violence during the act, then the individual responsible is likely someone who had the opportunity to access the scene and the intent to take property. This narrows the field of possibilities, but it does not eliminate uncertainty. In environments like Maui, where access can be relatively open and movement is fluid, identifying specific individuals who fit these criteria can be challenging. The lack of direct observation means that investigators must rely on indirect indicators, such as patterns of presence, proximity, and potential opportunity. Tracing these indicators requires a broader examination of the surrounding context. Investigators consider who might have been in the area at the relevant time, who had the ability to enter and leave without drawing attention, and who might have had a reason to engage in opportunistic theft. This process does not produce immediate answers, but it helps to define the scope of the investigation. It creates a framework within which potential leads can be evaluated, even in the absence of definitive evidence. One of the most significant challenges in this process is the reconstruction of the critical moment of escalation. While the overall sequence can be inferred, the specific actions that transformed the situation from theft to violence remain unclear. Investigators can identify that a confrontation occurred, but they cannot determine exactly how it unfolded. This limitation affects not only the narrative of the case, but also the ability to assign precise responsibility for each action within the sequence. The absence of a clear timeline further complicates this reconstruction. Without precise information about when each phase of the event occurred, investigators must rely on relative sequencing rather than exact timing. They can establish that the theft preceded the violence and that the violence resulted in death, but the intervals between these stages remain undefined. This lack of temporal precision makes it difficult to understand the pace of the escalation, whether it occurred in seconds or over a slightly longer period. Despite these limitations, the investigation does reach certain conclusions with a high degree of confidence. The most significant of these is the determination that the event was not a premeditated act of homicide. The evidence does not support the presence of planning or preparation for violence. Instead, it supports a model in which the initial intent was limited to theft, and the violence emerged as a response to an unforeseen complication. This conclusion is consistent with the patterns observed in the scene and with the absence of indicators associated with deliberate targeting. Another key conclusion is the role of direct interaction in triggering the escalation. The presence of the victim at the scene is not incidental but central to the development of the event. Without that presence, the theft might have proceeded without interruption. With it, the situation became unstable, leading to the sequence of actions that resulted in death. This relationship between presence and outcome is a defining feature of the case, highlighting the importance of situational dynamics in shaping events. As the investigation progresses, it must also confront the limitations imposed by the environment. The same openness that characterizes Maui as a place of ease and accessibility also creates challenges for law enforcement. The movement of individuals through shared spaces, the lack of strict boundaries, and the absence of continuous monitoring all contribute to gaps in the available data. These gaps cannot be fully closed, and as a result, certain aspects of the case remain unresolved. This does not mean that the investigation fails to provide understanding. On the contrary, it succeeds in establishing the essential structure of the event and in identifying the key factors that contributed to its outcome. What it cannot do is fill in every detail, reconstruct every action, or identify every variable with certainty. The case remains defined by both what is known and what cannot be known, by the interplay between evidence and absence. In the end, the investigation into the incident on Maui reveals as much about the nature of such events as it does about this specific case. It demonstrates how quickly situations can evolve beyond their original scope, how the absence of witnesses and the presence of environmental factors can limit understanding, and how the process of reconstruction depends on careful interpretation of incomplete information. It also underscores the importance of distinguishing between intent and outcome, of recognizing that the path from one to the other is not always direct or predictable. What emerges from this process is not a complete story in the traditional sense, but a framework of understanding. Within that framework, the transition from theft to violence is established, the role of interaction is defined, and the limitations of the investigation are acknowledged. It is within these boundaries that the case moves forward, carrying with it both the clarity of its conclusions and the uncertainty of its unanswered questions. The transition from investigation to judicial process in a case such as this is marked not by a sudden shift in clarity, but by a gradual reorganization of uncertainty into structured argument. On the island of Maui, where the original incident unfolded within a confined and unobserved space, the absence of direct evidence continues to shape every stage that follows. What the investigation assembled as a sequence of inferred events must now be translated into a form that can be evaluated within the framework of legal standards, where conclusions are not only drawn but tested against the threshold of proof. At the center of this process lies the question of intent. The investigation established that the initial act was one of theft, supported by the condition of the scene and the absence of indicators suggesting premeditated violence. However, within a courtroom setting, this distinction becomes more than a descriptive element. It becomes a critical factor in determining the nature of the charge and the interpretation of the actions that followed. The difference between an act that begins with the intent to kill and one that escalates into fatal violence during the commission of another crime is not merely semantic. It defines how responsibility is assigned and how the sequence of events is understood in legal terms. The prosecution, working from the framework established by investigators, would present the case as a continuous progression. The argument would emphasize that while the original motive centered on the acquisition of property, the subsequent actions resulted in death, and that this outcome is inseparable from the initial decision to commit the crime. In this perspective, the escalation is not an interruption of the act, but a direct consequence of it. The presence of the victim, the confrontation that followed, and the use of force are all presented as elements that arose within the same chain of intent, even if that intent evolved under pressure. To support this position, the prosecution would rely heavily on the physical evidence. The disturbed environment, consistent with theft, establishes the starting point. The additional signs of violence indicate the shift in the nature of the act. Together, these elements create a narrative that does not depend on eyewitness testimony, but on the logical relationship between different forms of evidence. The argument would not claim to reconstruct every moment in detail, but rather to demonstrate that the sequence, as understood, leads to a single, coherent conclusion, that the fatal outcome occurred during the commission of the theft and was therefore an extension of it. The defense, in contrast, would focus on the gaps within this narrative. The absence of direct observation, the lack of a precise timeline, and the inability to identify the exact moment of escalation all become points of contention. These gaps are not minor details. They are central to the question of certainty. In a legal context, the burden of proof requires that conclusions be supported beyond reasonable doubt, and the defense would argue that the uncertainties inherent in the case prevent such a standard from being met. Without clear evidence of how the interaction unfolded, it becomes difficult to determine whether the use of force was intentional, reactive, or the result of circumstances that cannot be fully understood. Another aspect of the defense's argument would likely address the nature of the escalation itself. While the investigation concluded that the violence was not premeditated, the legal implications of this conclusion are complex. If the act of violence arose spontaneously during the confrontation, then the question becomes whether it can be considered an extension of the original intent or a separate, unplanned reaction. This distinction has significant consequences, as it affects not only the classification of the crime but also the degree of responsibility assigned to the individual involved. The court, in evaluating these arguments, must navigate between the clarity of the physical evidence and the ambiguity of the missing details. The evidence provides a framework, but it does not fill in every gap. The absence of witnesses means that the court cannot rely on direct accounts to confirm the sequence of events. Instead, it must assess the plausibility of the narratives presented, weighing the consistency of each argument against the available data. This process does not eliminate uncertainty, but it seeks to determine whether the uncertainty is sufficient to challenge the conclusions drawn by the prosecution. In cases where evidence is primarily circumstantial, the coherence of the narrative becomes especially important. Each element must align with the others, creating a sequence that is both logical and consistent with the known facts. In this case, the progression from theft to confrontation to violence forms such a sequence, supported by the condition of the scene and the absence of alternative explanations that fit the evidence as effectively. However, the defense's emphasis on the unknown aspects of the interaction ensures that this sequence is not accepted without scrutiny. The outcome of this process, as defined by the available information, does not point to a definitive resolution in the form of a clearly identified and convicted individual. The data provided does not include confirmation of a suspect, nor does it indicate that the case reached a conclusive legal judgment. This absence is itself significant, as it reflects the limitations imposed by the nature of the evidence and the conditions under which the incident occurred. Without sufficient information to establish responsibility beyond doubt, the case remains within a space where conclusions are constrained by what cannot be proven. This does not mean that the legal process fails to provide understanding. On the contrary, it reinforces the conclusions reached during the investigation regarding the structure of the event. The recognition that the incident began as a theft and escalated into fatal violence is not disputed in its general form. What remains unresolved is the precise manner in which that escalation occurred and the identity of the individual responsible. These unresolved elements prevent the case from achieving closure in a legal sense, even as its broader characteristics are understood. The absence of a definitive outcome also highlights the difference between investigative certainty and legal certainty. Investigators may reach conclusions based on the balance of probabilities and the coherence of the evidence, but the legal system requires a higher standard. It demands that conclusions be supported by evidence that leaves little room for doubt, a standard that is difficult to meet in cases where key details are missing. This difference underscores the challenges inherent in translating investigative findings into legal judgments, particularly in cases defined by limited data. In the context of this case, the judicial process ultimately reflects the constraints imposed by the evidence. It acknowledges the progression of events as understood, recognizes the role of escalation, and considers the implications of intent, but it does not produce a final, definitive resolution. The absence of a confirmed perpetrator and the lack of a conclusive verdict leave the case in a state that is neither fully resolved nor entirely open. It exists within a boundary where understanding is present but closure is not. This outcome, while unsatisfying in some respects, is consistent with the nature of the case itself. From the moment of the incident, the sequence was defined by uncertainty, by the absence of observation and the reliance on inference. These characteristics persist through the investigation and into the legal process, shaping the limits of what can be known and what can be proven. The judicial stage does not eliminate these limitations. It brings them into sharper focus, highlighting the distinction between what is likely and what can be established with certainty. As the case moves beyond the courtroom, it carries with it the conclusions that have been reached and the questions that remain. The recognition of the event as a robbery that escalated into homicide stands as the central understanding, supported by the evidence and the analysis. At the same time, the absence of definitive answers regarding the specific actions and the individual responsible ensures that the case remains incomplete, a reflection of both the complexity of the incident and the boundaries of the systems designed to interpret it. The aftermath of the case extends far beyond the moment in which the incident concluded, settling instead into the routines and perceptions of those who continue to live and move within the environment where it occurred. On the island of Maui, where daily life is often shaped by continuity and familiarity, the presence of an unresolved violent event introduces a subtle but lasting shift. This shift is not always visible, nor is it consistently acknowledged, but it exists in the way people interpret space, in how they understand the boundaries between safety and vulnerability, and in the recognition that even environments perceived as stable can produce moments of irreversible consequence. For those connected to the victim, the aftermath is defined not by analysis but by absence. The structure of the case, with its lack of definitive answers and its reliance on inferred sequences, offers little in the way of closure. The understanding that the death resulted from a situation that escalated unexpectedly does not resolve the deeper questions about how exactly that escalation unfolded or whether it could have been prevented. This gap between understanding and closure becomes a persistent feature of the aftermath, shaping how the event is remembered and how it continues to affect those closest to it. Within the broader community, the case contributes to an evolving awareness of risk that is both specific and general. It is specific in the sense that it highlights a particular type of event, one in which a property crime transforms into violence through direct interaction. At the same time, it is general in that it reinforces the idea that risk does not always present itself in obvious forms. The environment of Maui, characterized by accessibility and openness, does not inherently signal danger, and yet it contains within it the conditions that can allow such events to occur. This duality complicates the way people engage with their surroundings, requiring a balance between trust and caution. The concept of opportunity becomes central to this reflection. The incident illustrates how opportunity operates not only for those who commit crimes but also in the formation of circumstances that enable escalation. The accessibility of property, the absence of immediate oversight, and the presence of individuals moving through shared spaces all contribute to a context in which opportunistic actions can take place. When these actions intersect with the presence of another person, the situation can change rapidly, moving beyond the original scope of intent. This understanding does not assign blame to the environment, but it acknowledges its role in shaping the conditions under which events unfold. At the same time, the case underscores the limitations of prediction. While it is possible to identify general patterns and contributing factors, it is far more difficult to anticipate the exact moment at which those factors will converge in a way that produces a critical event. The unpredictability of the interaction between individuals, particularly in situations involving stress or confrontation, means that outcomes cannot be fully controlled or foreseen. This unpredictability is one of the most unsettling aspects of the case, as it challenges the assumption that risk can always be managed through awareness alone. For law enforcement and those involved in investigative work, the case serves as a reminder of the constraints that define certain types of incidents. The absence of witnesses, the limited physical evidence, and the reliance on inference all highlight the challenges of reconstructing events that occur in isolation. These challenges are not unique to this case, but they are particularly pronounced here, where the transition from theft to violence occurs within a confined and unobserved space. The inability to fully reconstruct that transition limits not only the investigation but also the potential for resolution within the legal system. This limitation extends into the realm of public understanding. Cases that remain unresolved in key aspects often take on a different kind of presence within collective memory. They are not defined by clear narratives or definitive conclusions, but by the questions they leave behind. In this case, those questions center on the moment of escalation, on the precise actions that transformed a nonviolent act into a fatal one, and on the identity of the individual responsible. The absence of answers to these questions ensures that the case remains open in a conceptual sense, even if its broader structure is understood. The impact of this openness is complex. On one hand, it can lead to speculation, to attempts to fill in the gaps with assumptions or theories. On the other hand, it can also foster a more cautious and reflective approach to similar situations, encouraging a recognition of the factors that contribute to risk without relying on definitive explanations. In this way, the case functions both as a source of uncertainty and as a point of reference for understanding how certain types of events can develop. From a broader perspective, the case highlights the thin line that separates different categories of behavior. The distinction between property crime and violent crime, while clear in definition, becomes less stable in practice when circumstances change rapidly. The incident demonstrates how easily one can transition into the other, not through long-term planning, but through immediate reaction. This fluidity challenges the way such categories are perceived, emphasizing that they are not always fixed but can shift under pressure. The role of human response within this shift is particularly significant. The actions taken in moments of confrontation are often shaped by instinct, by the immediate assessment of threat and opportunity. These responses can be difficult to predict and even more difficult to reconstruct after the fact. In this case, the lack of detailed information about the interaction means that the human element remains partially obscured, understood only through its consequences. This partial understanding reinforces the idea that not all aspects of an event can be fully captured, even through thorough investigation. As time passes, the case becomes part of a larger pattern of incidents that illustrate the intersection of environment, opportunity, and human behavior. It does not stand alone, but it contributes to an ongoing conversation about how such intersections can lead to outcomes that are both unexpected and severe. Within this conversation, the case serves as an example of how quickly situations can evolve and how difficult it can be to fully understand them after they have occurred. Ultimately, the aftermath of the case is defined by a combination of knowledge and uncertainty. There is a clear understanding of the general sequence, of the progression from theft to violence, and the role of interaction in that progression. At the same time, there is an acknowledgement of the limits of that understanding, of the aspects that remain beyond reconstruction. This combination shapes how the case is remembered and how it continues to influence perceptions of safety and risk. The story does not end with a definitive conclusion, nor does it offer a resolution that fully addresses the questions it raises. Instead, it leaves behind a framework for reflection, a way of thinking about how events unfold and how they are understood. Within that framework, the case serves as both a specific instance and a broader example, illustrating the complexities of human behavior and the challenges of interpreting it within the constraints of evidence and time. In the extended reflection that follows the formal conclusion of the case, the narrative no longer belongs solely to investigators or legal frameworks, but to a broader space where interpretation, memory, and unresolved tension coexist. What occurred on the island of Maui does not settle into a single, definitive meaning. Instead, it persists as a layered event, one that continues to be examined not for new evidence, but for deeper understanding of its implications. The absence of complete answers does not diminish its impact. Rather, it amplifies it, allowing the case to function as a point of ongoing reflection about the nature of human behavior under pressure. At the center of this reflection is the realization that the incident cannot be reduced to a single defining moment. While the escalation from theft to fatal violence is understood as the critical transition, it is also clear that this transition is not an isolated phenomenon. It is the result of intersecting factors, each of which contributes to the overall trajectory of the event. Opportunity, presence, reaction, and environment all converge within a narrow window of time, creating a situation in which outcomes are determined not by long-term intention, but by immediate response. This convergence challenges conventional expectations about how and why violence occurs, emphasizing that it can emerge from conditions that, on the surface, appear limited in scope. The idea of escalation itself becomes a focal point of analysis. In many narratives of crime, escalation is portrayed as a gradual process, a series of steps that lead from one level of intensity to another. In this case, however, the escalation is abrupt, occurring within a compressed time frame that leaves little room for intervention or reconsideration. This abruptness is significant because it underscores the role of unpredictability. It suggests that the boundary between nonviolent and violent behavior is not always clearly marked, but can shift rapidly when circumstances change. This understanding complicates efforts to categorize behavior, revealing that actions cannot always be neatly separated into distinct types when they are influenced by dynamic conditions. Another dimension of the case lies in the relationship between control and loss of control. The initial act of theft implies a degree of control, a calculated decision to take advantage of a situation. However, the moment of confrontation introduces variables that disrupt this control. The presence of another person, the uncertainty of their reaction, and the need to respond quickly all contribute to a loss of stability within the situation. This loss of control is not necessarily absolute, but it is sufficient to alter the course of events in a way that cannot be reversed. The transition from controlled action to uncontrolled outcome becomes a defining feature of the incident, illustrating how quickly intention can be overtaken by circumstance. The role of the victim, though not defined by detailed personal information within the available data, remains central to the narrative. The victim's presence transforms the situation, introducing a human element that cannot be anticipated or fully understood. It is this presence that creates the conditions for escalation, that turns an act directed at property into an interaction between individuals. In reflecting on the case, there is an implicit recognition of the vulnerability that accompanies such moments, of how an ordinary presence within a space can intersect with an unintended situation in ways that have profound consequences. This recognition fosters a sense of empathy, not through detailed biography, but through the acknowledgement of circumstance. Within the broader context, the case also raises questions about the nature of responsibility. While the progression from theft to violence is established, the precise mechanisms of that progression remain unclear. This ambiguity affects how responsibility is perceived, not in terms of whether it exists, but in terms of how it is understood. The absence of detailed reconstruction means that certain aspects of the interaction cannot be fully evaluated, leaving open questions about the exact dynamics that led to the fatal outcome. These questions do not negate the existence of responsibility, but they complicate its interpretation, highlighting the limits of what can be known about human actions in unobserved moments. The environment in which the incident occurred continues to play a subtle but important role in this reflection. Maui, as a location characterized by openness and movement, provides a setting in which interactions can occur without immediate visibility. This characteristic does not define the event, but it contributes to the conditions that allow it to unfold as it did. The environment does not create intent, but it shapes the context in which intent is expressed and transformed. In this sense, the case becomes an example of how physical spaces interact with human behavior, influencing not only what happens, but how it can be understood afterward. As the case settles into its place within collective awareness, it begins to function less as a discrete event and more as a reference point. It informs how similar situations are perceived, how risks are evaluated, and how the boundaries between different types of behavior are understood. This influence is not always explicit, but it operates in the background, shaping perceptions in subtle ways. The recognition that a seemingly limited act can escalate into something far more severe becomes part of a broader understanding of how unpredictability operates within human interactions. The absence of closure remains one of the most enduring aspects of the case. Closure, in many instances, is associated with resolution, with the identification of a responsible party and a clear explanation of events. In this case, while the general structure of the incident is understood, the lack of definitive answers regarding specific details prevents a complete sense of resolution. This absence does not diminish the validity of the conclusions that have been reached, but it leaves space for ongoing reflection. It ensures that the case is not confined to a fixed narrative, but remains open to interpretation within the limits of the available evidence. This openness, while challenging, also serves a purpose.
It encourages a more nuanced approach to understanding similar Ghatan, one that acknowledges both the presence of evidence and the significance of what cannot be known.
It highlights the importance of considering multiple factors, of recognizing that events are rarely the result of a single cause, but of interactions between various elements that may not be fully visible. In doing so, it contributes to a more comprehensive understanding of how and why certain outcomes occur, even in the absence of complete information. In the final analysis, the case stands as an illustration of the complexity inherent in human behavior and the situations that arise from it. It demonstrates that actions cannot always be understood in isolation, that they are influenced by context, interaction, and the unpredictable nature of response. It shows that the line between different forms of behavior is not always fixed, but can shift under pressure, leading to outcomes that are both unexpected and irreversible. The story does not resolve into a single, definitive conclusion, but it does offer a framework for understanding. Within that framework, the progression from theft to violence is recognized, the role of interaction is acknowledged, and the limitations of knowledge are accepted. These elements combine to form a narrative that is both incomplete and meaningful, one that continues to resonate not because it provides all the answers, but because it reveals the complexity of the questions themselves. As the case continues to be revisited in broader discussions about crime, risk, and human behavior, it gradually shifts from a specific incident into a lens through which larger patterns can be examined. The events that unfolded on the island of Maui no longer exist only within the confines of their original timeline. Instead, they become part of an ongoing dialogue about how environments, decisions, and chance converge in ways that defy simple explanation. This transformation from isolated case to analytical reference does not change what happened, but it changes how what happened is understood over time. One of the most persistent themes that emerges from this continued reflection is the fragility of boundaries. The distinction between intention and outcome, between planning and reaction, becomes increasingly difficult to define with precision. In the initial interpretation of the case, the separation appears clear. A theft occurs, and then something unexpected leads to violence. However, when examined more closely, this sequence reveals a more complex interaction. The original intent may not have included violence, but the conditions under which the intent was carried out contain the possibility of escalation from the very beginning. This realization suggests that boundaries are not static lines but dynamic thresholds, influenced by context and circumstance. The concept of threshold is particularly relevant in understanding how quickly situations can change. A threshold represents a point at which one state becomes another, often with little warning. In this case, the threshold between nonviolent and violent action is crossed in a moment that cannot be precisely identified. The absence of a clear marker for this transition highlights the difficulty of predicting or preventing such events. It also emphasizes the importance of recognizing that thresholds exist even when they are not visible, that the potential for change is always present within certain conditions. Another important aspect of the case is the role of perception. For individuals moving through environments like Maui, perception often shapes behavior more strongly than objective risk. The island's reputation as a place of relaxation and accessibility creates an expectation of safety that may not fully account for the complexities of human interaction. This expectation does not create danger, but it can influence how people interpret their surroundings and how they respond to unexpected situations. In this context, the case serves as a reminder that perception and reality do not always align, and that understanding risk requires an awareness of both. The interplay between perception and reality also affects how the case is remembered. Over time, details that are uncertain may become simplified, while aspects that are clearly established may be emphasized to create a more coherent narrative. Preserving this complexity is essential to maintaining an accurate understanding of the event. From an analytical perspective, the case highlights the importance of examining not only what happened, but how it is interpreted. The absence of complete information requires a reliance on inference, and inference is shaped by the frameworks through which evidence is viewed. Different perspectives can lead to different conclusions, even when they are based on the same set of facts. In this case, the interpretation that the event represents a robbery that escalated into homicide is supported by the available evidence, but it is also shaped by the broader understanding of how such events typically unfold. Recognizing this influence does not weaken the conclusion, but it places it within a context that acknowledges the role of interpretation. The case also invites consideration of how similar incidents might be approached in the future. While it does not provide definitive answers, it offers insights into the factors that can contribute to escalation. These insights can inform both investigative practices and broader approaches to risk awareness. For investigators, the case underscores the importance of examining the relationships between different forms of evidence, of looking for patterns that indicate transitions within a sequence of events. For individuals, it highlights the need to remain aware of how quickly situations can change, even in environments that appear stable. At the same time, it is important to recognize the limits of what can be learned. Not every aspect of the case can be translated into general principles, and not every situation will follow the same pattern. The uniqueness of each event must be respected, even as broader themes are identified. This balance between generalization and specificity is crucial in ensuring that lessons drawn from the case are applied appropriately, without oversimplifying the factors that contribute to complex outcomes. The enduring significance of the case lies in its ability to challenge assumptions. It challenges the assumption that intent is always clear and fixed, showing instead that it can evolve under pressure. It challenges the assumption that environments can be fully understood in terms of safety or risk, demonstrating that both can coexist within the same space. It challenges the assumption that events can always be reconstructed with precision, revealing the limits of evidence and the persistence of uncertainty. These challenges are not obstacles to understanding, but opportunities for deeper reflection. They encourage a more nuanced approach to interpreting events, one that considers multiple factors and acknowledges the role of uncertainty. In this way, the case contributes to a broader understanding of how human behavior operates within complex environments and how outcomes are shaped by the interaction of intention, context, and chance. As the narrative continues to evolve, it becomes clear that the case does not offer a single lesson, but a series of interconnected insights. Each insight adds to a larger picture, one that is defined not by resolution, but by exploration. The absence of definitive answers does not diminish the value of the case. Rather, it enhances it by prompting ongoing inquiry.
It ensures that the case remains relevant, not only as a record of what occurred, but as a source of reflection on how similar ghटनाएं might be understood in the future.
In the end, the case stands as a reminder that understanding is often partial, that knowledge is built from both evidence and interpretation, and that uncertainty is an inherent part of both. It does not provide closure in the traditional sense, but it offers something equally important, a framework for thinking about complexity, about the ways in which events unfold, and about the limits of what can be known. Within this framework, the events on Maui continue to resonate, not as a solved problem, but as an enduring question that invites careful and thoughtful consideration. In the long arc of time that follows an unresolved act of violence, what remains is not only the record of what is known, but the persistent presence of what cannot be fully explained. The events that took place on the island of Maui gradually move beyond the boundaries of a single case file and enter a broader space where memory, interpretation, and uncertainty coexist. In this space, the incident is no longer defined solely by its immediate circumstances, but by the questions it continues to generate. These questions do not fade with time. Instead, they evolve, shaped by the perspectives of those who revisit the case and the frameworks through which it is understood. At the center of this enduring reflection is the recognition that the incident resists simplification. While it can be described as a theft that escalated into fatal violence, this description, though accurate within the limits of the available evidence, does not capture the full complexity of the event. It identifies the structure, but not the texture, of what occurred. The texture lies in the unseen moments, in the interaction between individuals that cannot be reconstructed in detail, in the precise sequence of decisions and reactions that led from one state to another. These elements remain beyond reach, and it is their absence that gives the case its lasting resonance. The persistence of unanswered questions shapes the way the case is integrated into collective understanding. It becomes an example not only of a specific type of crime, but of the broader challenges involved in interpreting events that occur without witnesses and with limited physical evidence. In such cases, understanding is built from fragments, from pieces of information that must be connected through inference rather than direct observation. This process is inherently uncertain, and the conclusions it produces are always subject to the limitations of the data on which they are based. The case, therefore, stands as a reminder of both the power and the limits of investigative reasoning. One of the most significant aspects of the case is the way it illustrates the interaction between intention and outcome. The initial act of theft suggests a specific purpose, one that is focused on the acquisition of property rather than the infliction of harm. However, the outcome of the event reveals a divergence from this purpose, a shift that occurs within the context of a direct encounter. This divergence highlights the instability of intention when it is subjected to changing conditions. It suggests that intention is not always a fixed guide to behavior, but can be altered by circumstances in ways that are difficult to predict and even more difficult to reconstruct after the fact. The moment of confrontation, though not directly observed, becomes the focal point of this analysis. It is within this moment that the transition from nonviolent to violent action occurs, and it is this transition that defines the case. Yet, because the details of this moment are unknown, it remains an area of ambiguity. Different interpretations are possible, each consistent with the available evidence, but differing in the way they conceptualize the interaction. This multiplicity of possible interpretations does not weaken the case. Rather, it underscores its complexity, emphasizing that certain aspects of human behavior cannot be reduced to a single, definitive explanation. The environment in which the incident took place continues to play a subtle but important role in shaping its interpretation. Maui, with its combination of accessibility and isolation, provides a setting in which interactions can occur without immediate oversight. This characteristic does not determine the outcome, but it influences the conditions under which the outcome becomes possible. The environment, in this sense, is not an active participant in the event, but a context that frames it, shaping both what happens and what can later be known about what happened. As the case is revisited over time, it also becomes a point of reference for discussions about risk and awareness. It challenges the assumption that risk is always visible or that it can be easily identified in advance. The incident demonstrates that risk can emerge from ordinary situations, from interactions that begin without clear signs of danger but evolve rapidly under pressure. This realization does not lead to a simple conclusion about how to avoid such outcomes, but it does encourage a more nuanced understanding of how they can arise. The role of uncertainty within this understanding is particularly important. Uncertainty is often viewed as a limitation, as something that prevents complete knowledge. In this case, however, it also functions as a reminder of the complexity of the real world. It highlights the fact that not all events can be fully captured or explained, that some aspects will always remain beyond the reach of evidence and analysis. This acknowledgement does not diminish the value of the investigation. Rather, it situates it within a realistic framework, one that recognizes both its achievements and its limits. The absence of a definitive conclusion also affects how the case is remembered and discussed. Without a clear resolution, the narrative remains open, allowing for continued examination and reinterpretation. This openness can lead to speculation, but it can also foster a more careful and reflective approach to understanding. It encourages a focus on what is known, on the evidence that supports the established sequence of events, while also acknowledging the areas where certainty is not possible. In this way, the case becomes not only a record of an incident, but a demonstration of how knowledge is constructed and how it is limited. In the broader context, the case contributes to an ongoing exploration of how human behavior operates under conditions of uncertainty and pressure. It illustrates how actions can change rapidly, how intentions can be overridden by immediate circumstances, and how outcomes can diverge significantly from initial expectations. These insights are not unique to this case, but they are particularly clear here, where the progression from one state to another is both evident and unexplained in its details. Ultimately, the significance of the case lies not in the answers it provides, but in the questions it leaves behind. These questions continue to shape the way the incident is understood, influencing both individual reflection and broader discussions about similar events. They ensure that the case remains relevant, not as a solved problem, but as an ongoing inquiry into the nature of human behavior and the limits of understanding. In this sense, the case does not conclude in the traditional way. It does not offer a final resolution or a complete account of what occurred. Instead, it settles into a space where knowledge and uncertainty coexist, where the known facts provide a framework but not a complete picture. Within this space, the events on Maui continue to resonate, not because they are fully understood, but because they reveal the complexity of what it means to seek understanding in situations where certainty is never fully attainable. Over time, cases that resist complete resolution do not disappear. Instead, they settle into a quieter, more persistent form of presence, one that exists in the background of collective awareness. The events that unfolded on the island of Maui gradually become less about the immediacy of what happened and more about how what happened continues to be understood. In this later stage of reflection, the case is no longer approached with the expectation of new evidence or decisive answers. Instead, it is examined for the patterns it reveals, for the ways in which it illustrates broader truths about human behavior, risk, and the limits of interpretation. One of the most enduring aspects of the case is the way it reframes the concept of intention. At the outset, the act of theft suggests a clear and limited purpose, one that is focused on property rather than harm. However, the outcome forces a reconsideration of how intention operates in real situations. It becomes evident that intention is not always stable, that it can shift rapidly in response to changing circumstances. This shift does not necessarily occur through deliberate reconsideration, but through immediate reaction, through the pressures that arise when a planned action encounters an unplanned variable. In this sense, the case highlights the fluidity of intention, showing that it can evolve in ways that are not fully controlled by the individual. This fluidity is closely linked to the concept of escalation, which remains central to understanding the incident. Escalation, in this context, is not a gradual buildup but a sudden transition, a movement from one state to another that occurs within a compressed time frame. The speed of this transition is significant because it limits the possibility of intervention, both from within the situation and from outside it. There is little opportunity for reconsideration once the threshold has been crossed, and the outcome is determined by a sequence of reactions that unfold too quickly to be altered. This dynamic underscores the importance of recognizing how quickly situations can change, and how difficult it can be to respond effectively in the moment. The role of interaction within this process is equally important. The presence of another individual transforms the situation, introducing an element of unpredictability that cannot be fully anticipated. Each person brings their own perceptions, their own responses, and their own capacity for action, and it is the interaction between these factors that shapes the course of events. In the absence of detailed information about this interaction, it remains partially obscured, understood only through its consequences. This limitation highlights the challenges of reconstructing human behavior, particularly in situations where there are no witnesses and no direct records of what occurred. As the case is considered within a broader framework, it also raises questions about how risk is perceived and managed. In environments like Maui, where the landscape is associated with leisure and accessibility, risk may not always be immediately apparent. The familiarity of the setting can create a sense of normalcy that obscures potential vulnerabilities. This does not mean that the environment itself is inherently dangerous, but it does suggest that perceptions of safety can influence how individuals navigate their surroundings. The case serves as a reminder that risk is not always visible and that it can emerge from situations that appear routine. The persistence of uncertainty within the case also shapes how it is integrated into collective memory. Without a definitive resolution, the narrative remains open, allowing for continued reflection and reinterpretation. This openness can be both a strength and a challenge. It allows for a more nuanced understanding of the event, one that acknowledges its complexity and avoids oversimplification. At the same time, it leaves space for ambiguity, for the possibility that certain aspects will never be fully understood. This balance between knowledge and uncertainty is a defining feature of the case, and it influences how it continues to be discussed over time. From an investigative perspective, the case illustrates the limits of what can be achieved in certain circumstances. The absence of witnesses, the limited physical evidence, and the rapid progression of events all contribute to a situation in which complete reconstruction is not possible. These limitations are not a reflection of failure, but of the inherent challenges involved in understanding events that occur in isolation. Recognizing these challenges is essential to maintaining a realistic perspective on what investigations can and cannot accomplish. The case also contributes to a broader understanding of how different types of crime can intersect. The transition from theft to violence demonstrates that categories of behavior are not always discrete, that they can overlap and evolve under specific conditions. This overlap complicates the way such incidents are classified and understood, emphasizing the need for flexible frameworks that can account for the dynamic nature of human actions. It also highlights the importance of considering context, of examining not only what happened but how and why it happened within a particular set of circumstances. As time passes, the case becomes less about the specifics of the incident and more about the insights it provides. It offers a perspective on how quickly situations can change, on how intentions can be altered by immediate pressures, and on how outcomes can diverge from initial expectations. These insights are not confined to this case alone. They have broader relevance, informing how similar situations are understood and approached. In this way, the case extends beyond its original context, contributing to an ongoing exploration of human behavior and its complexities. The enduring impact of the case lies in its ability to prompt reflection. It does not offer simple answers or clear conclusions, but it encourages a deeper consideration of the factors that shape events. It invites an examination of how individuals respond to unexpected situations, how environments influence behavior, and how knowledge is constructed from incomplete information. These reflections are not limited to those directly involved in the case. They extend to anyone who engages with its narrative, shaping how similar ghatnaएं are perceived and understood. In the final analysis, the case remains a study in complexity, a reminder that not all events can be fully explained or neatly categorized. It illustrates the interplay between intention, interaction, and environment, showing how each contributes to outcomes that are both specific and unpredictable. It acknowledges the limits of understanding while still providing a framework for reflection, a way of thinking about how and why certain events occur. The story does not conclude with certainty, but it does reach a form of equilibrium, a point at which the known and the unknown coexist without resolution. Within this equilibrium, the case continues to hold significance, not because it answers all questions, but because it preserves them. It remains an example of how events can unfold beyond expectation, how actions can shift in ways that are difficult to anticipate, and how understanding is shaped as much by what cannot be known as by what can. As the narrative continues into its later stages, the case gradually moves away from the immediate language of events and enters a deeper layer of interpretation, where its meaning is shaped less by new information and more by the way it is understood over time. What occurred on the island of Maui remains fixed in its essential structure, yet the way it is perceived continues to evolve. In this phase, the focus is no longer on reconstructing what happened, but on examining how the incident reflects broader patterns of human behavior and the conditions that allow those patterns to emerge. At the core of this reflection is the recognition that the incident represents a convergence of multiple forces rather than a single, isolated cause. The initial act of theft, the unexpected presence of the victim, the moment of confrontation, and the resulting escalation all form part of a chain that cannot be separated into independent segments without losing its coherence. Each element depends on the others, and the outcome is shaped by their interaction. This interconnectedness challenges the tendency to isolate causes, suggesting instead that understanding requires a holistic approach, one that considers the full context in which actions occur. The notion of convergence also highlights the role of timing. The sequence of events unfolds within a narrow window, where each moment influences the next in rapid succession. Timing, in this sense, is not merely a background factor but a central component of the outcome. A slight variation in when or how events occurred could have led to a different result, yet the specific alignment of circumstances produces the reality that is observed. This sensitivity to timing underscores the unpredictability inherent in such situations, emphasizing that outcomes are often contingent on precise and unrepeatable conditions. Another significant dimension of the case lies in the tension between predictability and unpredictability. On one hand, the progression from theft to confrontation to violence follows a pattern that is recognized in criminological analysis. On the other hand, the specific details of how this progression occurs in any given instance remain unpredictable. This tension reflects a broader truth about human behavior. While general patterns can be identified, individual events are shaped by variables that cannot be fully anticipated. The case exemplifies this dynamic, showing how a recognizable structure can coexist with an irreducible element of uncertainty. The role of environment continues to influence this understanding, not as a determining factor, but as a contextual one. Maui, with its combination of accessibility, isolation, and movement, provides a setting in which interactions can occur without immediate visibility. This characteristic does not create the conditions for violence on its own, but it affects how those conditions can develop and how they are later interpreted. The environment shapes the boundaries of what is possible, influencing both the occurrence of events and the ability to reconstruct them afterward. As the case is examined within this broader framework, it also raises questions about the nature of agency. Agency, in this context, refers to the capacity of individuals to make decisions and to act upon them. The initial act of theft demonstrates a clear exercise of agency, a deliberate choice to engage in a specific behavior. However, as the situation evolves, the clarity of agency becomes less distinct. The moment of escalation involves reactions that may not be fully deliberate, responses that occur under pressure and without the opportunity for reflection. This shift complicates the understanding of responsibility, not in terms of its existence, but in terms of how it is expressed within rapidly changing conditions. The victim's role within this dynamic remains central, even in the absence of detailed personal information. The victim's presence introduces the possibility of interaction, transforming a solitary act into a shared moment with unpredictable consequences. This transformation is crucial, as it creates the conditions under which escalation can occur. In reflecting on the case, the victim is not defined by the circumstances alone, but by the recognition that their presence altered the trajectory of events in a way that could not have been anticipated. The persistence of uncertainty continues to shape how the case is understood. Despite the identification of key elements and the establishment of a general sequence, certain aspects remain beyond reach. The precise nature of the interaction, the specific triggers of escalation, and the exact progression of actions cannot be fully reconstructed. This absence of detail does not invalidate the conclusions that have been drawn, but it limits their scope, ensuring that the case remains open to interpretation within defined boundaries. This openness has important implications for how the case is integrated into broader discussions. It encourages a careful approach to generalization, one that recognizes the uniqueness of each event while still identifying patterns that may have wider relevance. The case becomes a point of reference, not because it provides definitive answers, but because it illustrates the complexity of the questions involved. It shows that understanding is often partial, that it requires an acceptance of both knowledge and uncertainty. The case also contributes to an ongoing dialogue about how individuals navigate risk within their environments. It highlights the fact that risk is not always apparent, that it can emerge from interactions that begin without clear signs of danger. This realization does not lead to a simple set of guidelines, but it does encourage a more nuanced awareness of how situations can change. It emphasizes the importance of recognizing that even routine circumstances can contain elements of unpredictability. As the narrative reaches this stage, it becomes clear that the case does not offer closure in the traditional sense. There is no final resolution that eliminates uncertainty or provides a complete account of what occurred. Instead, the case settles into a state of equilibrium where the known facts and the unknown details coexist. This equilibrium is not a limitation, but a reflection of the reality that not all events can be fully explained. In this final phase of reflection, the case stands as a testament to the complexity of human behavior and the conditions in which it unfolds. It demonstrates that actions are shaped by a combination of intention, interaction, and context, and that these factors can produce outcomes that are both structured and unpredictable. It acknowledges the limits of understanding while still offering a framework for thinking about how events occur. The story does not end with certainty, but it does reach a point of sustained meaning. It remains relevant not because it resolves all questions, but because it continues to provoke them. It invites ongoing consideration of how individuals act under pressure, how environments influence behavior, and how knowledge is constructed from incomplete information. Within this ongoing process, the events on Maui retain their significance, not as a closed chapter, but as an enduring exploration of the boundaries of understanding. As the narrative moves further away from the immediate gravity of the incident, what remains is not a diminishing of significance, but a transformation of it. The events that once demanded urgent answers now invite sustained reflection, existing not only as a record of a crime, but as a framework through which broader questions can be explored. On the island of Maui, where the incident unfolded, the physical landscape remains unchanged, yet the meaning attached to what occurred there continues to evolve. This evolution is shaped not by new evidence, but by the ways in which the case is revisited, reconsidered, and reinterpreted over time. At this stage, the case becomes less about identifying specific actions and more about understanding the conditions that allow such actions to take place. The transition from theft to violence, which defines the core of the incident, is no longer viewed solely as a sequence of events, but as an example of how certain environments and circumstances can create the potential for rapid escalation. This perspective does not alter the facts, but it shifts the focus toward the underlying dynamics that connect those facts. It suggests that what occurred is part of a broader pattern, one that extends beyond the boundaries of a single case. One of the key elements in this broader perspective is the concept of instability. Instability, in this context, refers to the way in which situations can change quickly and unpredictably when multiple variables are in play. The initial act of theft introduces one variable, the presence of the victim introduces another, and the interaction between them creates a dynamic that is inherently unstable. This instability does not guarantee a specific outcome, but it increases the likelihood of rapid and significant change. The case illustrates how such instability can lead to outcomes that are disproportionate to the initial intent, emphasizing the importance of understanding how different factors interact within a given situation. The role of human response within this instability is particularly significant. Responses are not always calculated or deliberate. They can be immediate, shaped by perception, emotion, and the pressures of the moment. In the absence of detailed information about the interaction, it is not possible to determine exactly how these responses unfolded. However, the outcome indicates that they played a critical role in the transition from nonviolent to violent action. This highlights a fundamental aspect of human behavior, the capacity for actions to shift rapidly under certain conditions, even when those actions were not part of the original intent. As the case is examined through this lens, it also raises questions about how responsibility is understood. Responsibility, in legal terms, may be defined by specific criteria, but in a broader sense, it is connected to the ability to anticipate and control one's actions. The case suggests that this ability can be compromised in situations characterized by instability and rapid change. This does not negate responsibility, but it complicates the way it is conceptualized, emphasizing that actions are often influenced by factors that extend beyond deliberate intention. The environment in which the incident took place continues to serve as an important context for this analysis. Maui, with its combination of openness and isolation, provides a setting where interactions can occur without immediate oversight. This characteristic does not determine behavior, but it shapes the conditions under which behavior takes place. It influences both the occurrence of events and the ability to reconstruct them afterward, reinforcing the idea that environment plays a subtle but significant role in shaping outcomes. Over time, the case also becomes a reference point for discussions about how individuals perceive and respond to risk. The incident demonstrates that risk is not always associated with clearly identifiable threats. Instead, it can emerge from ordinary situations, from interactions that begin without apparent danger but evolve rapidly under specific conditions. This understanding challenges the assumption that risk can always be anticipated or avoided, highlighting the need for a more nuanced approach to recognizing and responding to potential threats. The persistence of unanswered questions continues to define the case. Despite the identification of key elements and the establishment of a general framework, certain aspects remain unknown. These gaps in knowledge are not simply the result of incomplete investigation. They reflect the inherent limitations of reconstructing events that occur without direct observation. The absence of complete information ensures that the case remains open to interpretation, allowing for multiple perspectives to coexist within the same narrative. This openness has a lasting impact on how the case is remembered. Without a definitive resolution, it resists closure, remaining active within discussions about crime, behavior, and understanding. It becomes an example of how certain events cannot be fully resolved, not because of a lack of effort, but because of the nature of the circumstances in which they occur. This recognition does not diminish the importance of the case. Rather, it enhances it by highlighting the complexity of the issues involved. As the narrative continues to unfold in this reflective phase, the focus shifts toward the broader implications of what occurred. The case is no longer viewed in isolation but as part of a larger context in which similar ghatnaएं can be examined and understood. It contributes to an ongoing exploration of how human behavior operates within complex environments, how actions are influenced by both intention and circumstance, and how outcomes are shaped by the interaction of multiple factors. In this context, the case serves as both a specific example and a general illustration. It provides insight into a particular incident while also offering a framework for understanding other situations that share similar characteristics. This dual role is what allows the case to maintain its relevance over time, ensuring that it continues to be examined and discussed even in the absence of new developments. Ultimately, the significance of the case lies in its ability to sustain inquiry. It does not provide definitive answers, but it encourages ongoing reflection, prompting questions about how and why certain events occur. It highlights the limits of knowledge while also demonstrating the value of continued analysis, showing that understanding is not a fixed endpoint, but a process that evolves over time. As the story approaches its final stages, it becomes clear that its impact is not confined to the moment in which the events took place. Instead, it extends into the present, shaping the way similar incidents are perceived and interpreted. The events on Maui remain a point of reference, not because they are fully understood, but because they exemplify the complexity of seeking understanding in situations where certainty is never complete. In the final stage of reflection, the case no longer exists as an active investigation or even as a question awaiting resolution, but as something more enduring and more difficult to define. It becomes part of a larger landscape of human experience, where individual events are absorbed into a broader understanding of how uncertainty, intention, and circumstance intersect. On the island of Maui, where the incident once unfolded in a brief and irreversible moment, there is no visible marker that distinguishes that point in time from any other. The physical world continues as it always has, unchanged by the passage of a single event, while the meaning of that event persists only in memory, in analysis, and in the quiet, unresolved questions that remain. What defines this final perspective is not the search for new information, but the acceptance of limits. The case demonstrates, with clarity and restraint, that there are situations in which complete understanding is not attainable. This is not due to a lack of effort or attention, but to the nature of the circumstances themselves. When an event occurs quickly, without witnesses, and within an environment that does not preserve clear evidence, the ability to reconstruct it in full detail is inherently constrained. The result is a narrative that is structurally sound yet incomplete, one that outlines what happened without fully revealing how or why each moment unfolded as it did. Within this framework, the case invites a reconsideration of what it means to understand an event. Understanding is often associated with certainty, with the ability to explain each element in a clear and definitive way. However, this case suggests that understanding can also exist alongside uncertainty, that it can be partial, contingent, and open-ended. It shows that it is possible to recognize patterns, to identify key dynamics, and to draw meaningful conclusions, even when some aspects remain unknown. This form of understanding is less absolute, but it is no less valuable, as it reflects the complexity of the reality it seeks to describe. The transition from theft to violence remains the central axis around which this understanding is organized. It is a transition that is both recognizable and elusive, familiar in its general form, yet inaccessible in its specific details. The case captures this duality, presenting a sequence that can be outlined but not fully inhabited. The absence of detail does not diminish the significance of the transition. Rather, it emphasizes the importance of the conditions that made it possible. It points to the role of interaction, of timing, and of immediate response, all of which contribute to the outcome without being fully visible within the available evidence. As the narrative reaches its conclusion, the focus shifts toward the enduring implications of these dynamics. The case becomes a lens through which broader questions can be examined, questions about how individuals act under pressure, how environments shape possibilities, and how outcomes emerge from the intersection of multiple factors. These questions extend beyond the specifics of the incident, connecting it to a wider field of inquiry that includes not only criminology but also psychology, sociology, and the study of human behavior more generally. One of the most significant contributions of the case is its illustration of how ordinary circumstances can give rise to extraordinary outcomes. The initial act of theft, while unlawful, belongs to a category of behavior that is often perceived as limited in scope. Yet, within the context of this incident, it becomes the starting point for a sequence that leads to irreversible consequences. This transformation underscores the unpredictability of human interaction, showing that even familiar actions can produce outcomes that are far beyond what was initially intended. The role of perception within this process is also critical. Perception shapes how individuals interpret their surroundings, how they assess risk, and how they respond to unexpected developments. In situations where perception is influenced by incomplete information or by the pressures of the moment, actions can diverge significantly from intention. The case highlights this divergence, suggesting that the gap between what is perceived and what is actual can play a decisive role in shaping outcomes. This insight adds another layer to the understanding of how events unfold, emphasizing that behavior is not only a function of intention but also of interpretation. Over time, The case also becomes a point of reference for discussions about the limits of prevention. It raises questions about how such incidents can be anticipated or avoided, and about the extent to which individuals can control the conditions in which they find themselves. While it does not provide definitive answers, it suggests that prevention is not always a matter of eliminating risk, but of recognizing that risk can arise in unexpected ways. This recognition does not eliminate uncertainty, but it offers a more realistic framework for understanding how it operates. The absence of closure remains a defining feature of the case. There is no final statement that resolves all questions, no single explanation that accounts for every aspect of what occurred. Instead, the case concludes with a form of equilibrium, a balance between what is known and what remains uncertain. This equilibrium is not a weakness, but a reflection of the reality that some events cannot be fully contained within a single narrative. It acknowledges that understanding is an ongoing process, one that continues even after the formal boundaries of the case have been reached. In this final reflection, the case stands as a testament to the complexity of human experience. It shows that actions are shaped by a combination of intention, context, and interaction, and that these elements can produce outcomes that are both structured and unpredictable. It demonstrates that understanding is not always complete, but that it can still be meaningful, providing insight into the dynamics that underlie specific events. The story does not end with a definitive conclusion, but it does reach a point of lasting significance. It remains present not as a solved problem, but as an enduring question, one that continues to invite examination and reflection. The events on Maui are no longer immediate, but they are not distant either. They exist in a space where past and present intersect, where the memory of what happened continues to inform the way similar situations are understood. In the end, the case offers something that is both limited and profound. It does not provide all the answers, but it clarifies the nature of the questions. It shows that the search for understanding is not always about reaching a final conclusion, but about engaging with complexity, about recognizing the interplay of factors that shape outcomes, and about accepting that some aspects of human behavior will always remain beyond complete explanation. In the final extension of the narrative, beyond where most cases would ordinarily conclude, the story no longer advances through events, but through meaning. What happened on the island of Maui remains unchanged in its essential outline, yet its significance continues to expand as it is revisited through different lenses of understanding. At this point, the case becomes less about resolution and more about the enduring relationship between knowledge and uncertainty, between what can be reconstructed and what remains permanently out of reach. It is within this tension that the case finds its lasting place, not as a closed account, but as an evolving reflection on the nature of human action and its consequences. One of the most striking aspects of this final perspective is the recognition that the absence of a complete narrative does not equate to the absence of meaning. On the contrary, the gaps within the case are what give it depth, allowing it to be examined from multiple angles without being confined to a single explanation. These gaps are not empty spaces, but areas of possibility, where different interpretations can coexist without invalidating one another. This multiplicity does not weaken the understanding of the case. Rather, it enriches it, highlighting the complexity of events that unfold without direct observation. At the center of this complexity is the idea that actions cannot always be fully separated from the conditions in which they occur. The initial act of theft, the presence of the victim, and the moment of escalation are not isolated components, but parts of a continuous interaction shaped by context. This interaction is influenced by factors that extend beyond individual intention, including the environment, the timing of events, and the immediate responses of those involved. In this sense, the case illustrates how outcomes are often the product of converging elements rather than a single, linear cause. The concept of convergence becomes increasingly important in this stage of reflection. It suggests that events are not simply the result of one factor acting independently, but of multiple factors intersecting at a specific point in time. In the case at hand, the convergence of opportunity, presence, and reaction creates a situation in which escalation becomes possible. This convergence is not predictable in its exact form, but it follows patterns that can be recognized in retrospect. Understanding these patterns does not eliminate uncertainty, but it provides a framework for interpreting how and why certain outcomes occur. Another dimension of the case lies in its exploration of how human behavior adapts under pressure. The transition from a controlled action, such as theft, to an uncontrolled outcome, such as fatal violence, highlights the limits of deliberate intention. It shows that behavior can shift rapidly when confronted with unexpected variables, and that these shifts can have consequences that extend far beyond the original scope of action. This insight is particularly significant because it challenges the assumption that actions are always guided by stable intentions. Instead, it reveals that intention itself can be fluid, influenced by the dynamics of the moment. The role of perception continues to be a key factor in this understanding. Perception shapes how individuals interpret their surroundings, how they assess the behavior of others, and how they decide to act in response. In situations where perception is incomplete or distorted by stress, the resulting actions may diverge significantly from what might be expected under different conditions. The case underscores the importance of this dynamic, suggesting that the gap between perception and reality can be a decisive factor in the development of events. As the narrative reaches this level of abstraction, it also invites consideration of how such cases are integrated into collective knowledge. Over time, the details of the incident may become less prominent, while the patterns it represents gain greater significance. The case becomes part of a larger body of examples that illustrate how certain types of situations can unfold, contributing to a broader understanding of human behavior and its complexities. This integration does not diminish the individuality of the case, but it places it within a context that allows its insights to be applied more widely. The persistence of uncertainty remains a defining feature throughout this process. Despite the development of frameworks and the identification of patterns, certain aspects of the case cannot be resolved. These unresolved elements serve as a reminder of the limits of knowledge, emphasizing that not all questions can be answered, even with careful analysis. This recognition is not a failure of understanding, but a reflection of the reality that some events occur in ways that resist complete explanation. In this final stage, the case also highlights the importance of maintaining a balance between analysis and humility. Analysis seeks to interpret and explain, to bring clarity to complex situations. Humility acknowledges that this clarity is never absolute, that it is always subject to the limitations of the available information. Together, these approaches create a form of understanding that is both rigorous and realistic, one that strives for insight while accepting the boundaries within which it operates. The narrative, as it concludes, does not offer a definitive answer to the questions it raises. Instead, it provides a framework for ongoing reflection, a way of thinking about how events unfold and how they are understood over time. Within this framework, the case serves as both a specific instance and a broader example, illustrating the interplay between intention, context, and outcome. It shows that understanding is not a static achievement, but a continuous process, one that evolves as perspectives change and as new connections are made. Ultimately, the enduring significance of the case lies in its ability to remain open. It does not close itself off with a final explanation, but continues to invite examination, to encourage deeper consideration of the factors that shape human behavior. It stands as a reminder that the search for understanding is not always about reaching a conclusion, but about engaging with complexity, about recognizing the interplay of certainty and uncertainty that defines real-world events. In this sense, the case becomes more than a record of what happened. It becomes a reflection on how we seek to understand what happens, on the methods we use, the assumptions we bring, and the limits we encounter. It shows that, even in the absence of complete answers, there is value in the process of inquiry, in the effort to make sense of events that challenge our expectations and expand our perspective. And within that effort, the events on Maui continue to resonate, not as a closed story, but as an enduring exploration of the boundaries of knowledge and the complexity of human action.